Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko tōku ingoa, Craig Elliffe, and I have to say it's an absolute pleasure to be elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand. Thank you very much. I admire anyone who has the ability to present their work in a 10-minute time frame. So I haven't actually really tried to do that. Rather, I've set out to answer two significant questions, two important questions that are tax related. And as you can see, these questions are in fact related to the research that I have done. The first is really an international question. This is not completely available for New Zealand to solve by itself. It has to do so in the good company of all the other countries around the world. And that is, will highly profitable and often highly digitalised multinational enterprises be forced to pay tax in the market jurisdiction? The second question is a much more New Zealand specific question to do with tax. Will New Zealand need new tax bases to cope with the existing structural deficit? So dealing first with the first question, and that is, what's the issue? Well, the issue is this. The tax settings that New Zealand has and are part of an international tax treaty network that was designed just after the First World War and concerned the so-called 1920s compromise. These are baked into all our existing tax agreements, and so they serve as our current law, and they're kind of more difficult to change in many respects because they are part of an international treaty network, and that involves negotiation and agreement with those other countries. They establish that taxing rights for any country in terms of source taxing rights, that is the ability to tax foreigners or multinationals that are doing business in your country, that only occurs where you have a permanent establishment in your country. And if you think back to the 1920s and the 1930s, it was critical for businesses to actually have physical presence in a country in order to do a substantial amount of or a significant amount of business, i.e. they had to have often bricks and mortar, or they had to have arrangements that was established firmly in your country in order to have a taxing right. Of course, now the situation with multinationals, particularly highly digitalised ones, is that they can do significant business in a jurisdiction without having any form of fixed place of business or a permanent establishment. And so the effect of our tax treaty network, which is now 100 years old, is that tax treaties prevent the source country from being able to impose its taxes on New Zealand sourced profits. So what options were available and are available? Well, in actually what has been quite a brilliant piece of work by the OECD and a broader group, there are now 147 countries around the world. They have looked at a whole new system for reallocating taxing rights. And the technique that they used in order to break through from the existing international tax order was to say, well, actually, companies, particularly large multinational entities, make both residual profits and fixed profits, really, from and these are profits which are made from routine transactions determined under transfer pricing rules. The residual profits are the super profits, and they are particularly common for large multinationals. In fact, it's the reasons why large multinationals exist. They're to do with supply chain issues, the ability to develop and progress enormously powerful intellectual property, and so they make a lot of this super profit or residual profits by virtue of their size, their ability, their dominance of markets, and their control of the supply chain. So the brilliance of the OECD inclusive framework suggestion for the taxation of these multinational profits is to say, well, okay, we'll take a small proportion, being 25% of the residual profits, which are the profits above routine profits. And an approximation of that is that where you've got a multinational that's making a profit above 10%, which is taken as a percentage of revenue, that this will be an indication of these types of residual profits, and 25% of them can be allocated to the market jurisdiction. This was expected to allocate US $125 billion to market jurisdictions, but this was unfortunately and unilaterally cancelled by the Trump administration in 2025. It's important to realize that the US buy-in to all of this is terribly important because, of course, they have so many of large multinationals, particularly in these highly digitalised businesses. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us in a very awkward position at the minute because the OECD are coming back, having achieved a modest win on the global minimum tax. They are now trying to go back and have a look at this, and they'll be trying hard, I guess, to talk with the US in order to try and establish a better basis for the implementation of this multilateral solution. And it definitely is an example of something that would be something for us all to strive to, because it would be coordinated. It would involve reducing double taxation, which is obviously a negative. And I think it uses rather brilliantly the technology that transfer pricing has used, multinationals have used to allocate profits to low tax jurisdictions. It uses that very same technology to allocate the profits to the market jurisdictions. And New Zealand, of course, would be a net winner from this. We don't have any of the requisite sized multinational enterprises that have to have a size of more than 20 billion, turnover of more than 20 billion euros, $40 billion roughly. We wouldn't have any in that category, and therefore it would only be our market taxing rights that would be enhanced by this regime. In the alternative, we will have to consider unilateral domestic taxes, such as digital services taxes, and I'm afraid that is disruptive, and although one doesn't use the term ugly, it's an ugly tax because it facilitates double taxation. So turning to the second question, and this is another, sort of enormously problematic issue for New Zealand, and this is will New Zealand actually need new tax bases to cope with the existing structural deficit? Now, this might shock some people and of course be very unsurprising to the majority of the audience. But New Zealand has been running a structural deficit since 2019-2020. So what is that? It basically means that the revenue that the government derives simply is insufficient to meet our expenditure. So a household couldn't operate like this, but that's of course an oversimplification, because there are in fact three things that a government can do. They can raise revenue, and that might be new taxes, but it might also be an increased improvement to the economy. They can restrict and reduce expenditure, and thirdly, they can borrow. So all of those three things are open But this structural deficit that we have is one of the largest in advanced economies, and it doesn't factor in, I stress, doesn't factor in the known risks in population aging, climate change, and infrastructural needs. So it sort of like ignores some of the major problems. Just to give you an example on the population aging issue, we have, of course, a pension funded by general taxation. And when that was sort of kind of discussed and set up, it was, of course, subsequent to 1965, but we used to have 7 workers to 1 person who was aged over 65. Currently, that is now 4 to 1. By 2065, it'll be 2 to 1. So basically, that means that the current cost of our existing pension arrangements will move from 5.1% of GDP to 8% of GDP by 2065. And this will not be met by the New Zealand Super Fund defraying that cost. Likewise, our healthcare costs, which, on the assumption that we have an equivalence level or standard as we currently have, they will increase from 7.1% of GDP to 10% of GDP. Now, what this suggests to me, to me at least, is that the structural deficit is not going to improve by virtue of our expenditure situation. Quite the reverse. In fact, it's going to have a significant strain, unless there is more revenue or reduction in those costs or other costs. So that's the issue, basically. So the options are, in November of last year, the Treasury suggested that the current structural deficit's around about $8.5 billion. Now, I'm not sure whether the current situation is going to improve that or not. I imagine the much hoped for improvement in the economic environment has been derailed by the Iran war, and so the 3 levers in order to try and meet that deficit are to increase revenue, decrease expenditure, or borrow. So all of those things are open to a government. It has to consider what the best option is. As you will be aware, the most recent tax working group, of which I was a member, recommended a comprehensive capital gains tax at marginal tax rates. But I think I actually have come to the view consistent with Inland Revenue's most recent work on their long-term insights briefing, and they've looked at the benefits of having those taxes on capital, but to have them on lower rates than on labour. This would be consistent with some of the Scandinavian countries, the Nordic countries. They operate what are called dual income tax systems, where labour is taxed more progressively than capital. And the reason fundamentally is international competitiveness in terms of foreign direct investment. The position being that capital is highly mobile, and that if you overtax your capital, then you don't receive a reasonable proportion relative to other countries. Other options, of course, include things such as wealth taxes, increases to GST, or an increase to the income marginal tax rates. So the possible and imagined future, well, I think a little bit like the answer to the first question, whilst things change is difficult, when there is a problem, there needs to be a solution. And I think the solution for future governments will be a combination of each of those levers being pulled. In other words, there will need to be some response on the tax base and an increase, and I think particularly to the taxation of capital, because New Zealand is very much an outlier, and it's not been great for our productivity, nor our selection of investments. We've had a predominance into residential real estate, which is mirrored by other countries like Australia, but still, we are in a situation where the whole 8.5 billion might not be funded by any one solution, but it might be funded by a combination of all of the three alternatives of increasing borrowing, reducing expenditure, and imposing tax. And I think the reason why taxation of capital, even at a lower rate, is desirable is because some of the other options, whilst they do have their own significant advantages, for instance, increasing GST would be very efficient and would be, and if the regressive nature for lower income households could be compensated in some way, that might be an excellent solution. There are the other options do come with a range of difficult problems, and perhaps just to conclude, I once again, this is an ongoing and significant matter for us. Informed debate is a very positive thing, and thank you again for this opportunity, and I look forward to being a contributing member of the Royal Society. Thank you.